Americans for Fair Taxation presents the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, president of Americans for Fair Taxation, and recorded by Bob Paxton, a volunteer with the Florida FAIRtax Educational Association. And now, this week's Chairman's Report.
Hello, I'm Bob Paxton with the AFFT Chairman's Report for Friday, October 15th, 2021. The Budget and the Fair Tax, How Democracy is Supposed to Work. Fiscal irresponsibility has created a disease that has infected all of us. We're all receiving benefits from the government in some form or another. Now, most of these payments are coming not from federal tax revenues, but by the Federal Reserve printing money and increasing the national debt. Now, even during the worst of the COVID-mandated shutdowns, no government workers missed a paycheck, even though they stayed home. Social Security recipients continued to receive their payments. Medicare payments were made. Teachers continued to be paid. Aid recipients continued to be paid. The military continued to operate and be paid. People on unemployment or who went on unemployment received additional federal funds and extended benefit periods. Many businesses were loaned money to help them survive, and those loans were forgiven. The businesses were allowed to deduct the payments, and this means the loan was essentially free money. And now there are tax-free payments being made to parents with children. In fact, very few areas of our society don't receive benefits in one form or another from the government. Now, the ruling class knew that the American people were not going to question the source of these benefits. There would be little to no objection to having the relief come from borrowed funds. However, as has been the case throughout history, the ruling class knows that once people get used to receiving free benefits, they're not going to do anything that would threaten those benefits. And that's true even when people know that the money they're getting is borrowed and that the debt will be a burden on later generations. There's an old saying, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. The ruling class and their minions in D.C. know the truth of that saying. However, the ugly truth is that they don't want to teach people how to fish. They want as many people as possible coming to them for their free fish every day. They know that as long as they continue to deliver free benefits, the people will let them stay in power. The problem is this plan only works for as long as the ruling class can continue to borrow money. They know that tax revenue alone is not sufficient to fund all their free giveaways, and that increasing taxes too much will just lead to more evasion and likely resistance that could result in their being overthrown. Their solution? Use money created by the Federal Reserve. While this adds to the national debt, it keeps taxes at a tolerable level. And as long as money is available to borrow, the ruling class sees it as basically free money. Now let's look at interest rates in the federal debt. As we discussed in last week's Chairman's Report, most state and local governments have to operate in much the same way as individuals with regard to their budgets. How much they can spend is limited by how much they can take in. One fact that's often ignored is that even before the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, the United States often had carried high amounts of debt relative to GDP. Now, there's a chart in an article at usgovernmentspending.com that tracks the national debt as a percentage of GDP. That chart is reproduced in the printed version of the Chairman's Report published at FAIRtax.org. It shows that in 2020, our national debt as a percentage of GDP was at the highest level since the founding of the country. There's another chart there also showing the growth of the debt for state and local governments versus the federal government. Now, it's interesting that the 16th Amendment was passed in 1913, the same year the Federal Reserve was created. From that point forward, gross debt for local and state governments has increased some, but federal gross debt has soared, and that's no coincidence. Now, of course, a significant factor in the rise of all debt by both consumers and governments is that interest rates have been very low for a long time. Today, the federal borrowing rate is about 2.2%. However, this is changing because the rate of inflation is increasing rapidly. Now, in simple terms, inflation means that prices are rising, thereby degrading your purchasing power by diminishing the value of your money. At a 6% inflation rate, prices will double in just 12 years, so a dollar then will buy only half as much as it does today. In effect, your dollar has lost half of its value. Now, many of the experts tell us that the recent increase in prices is just temporary, But oil is now over $80 a barrel, and in some California towns, people are paying nearly $5 a gallon for gas. Grocery prices are also steadily increasing all over the country. And through it all, the experts are asking, are you going to believe us or your lying eyes? Now, interest rates must increase as inflation rises. If inflation continues at 6%, lenders cannot loan money at 6% because they'll receive no net return on the loan. For example, assume a lender makes a 12-year, $100,000 loan at 6% interest. In 12 years, when the loan and the accumulated interest have been repaid, the lender would have received $201,220. However, 6% inflation will have reduced the value of that $201,220 to just $100,610 in today's dollars. The lender, in effect, receives nothing. And no prudent lender would make this loan. Now, the federal government is not immune to the basic laws of economics. If inflation continues to rise, the federal government will have to start paying higher interest rates. Now, according to this analysis in thebalance.com, interest paid on the federal debt reduces the amount of money available for other government programs. And the World Bank says a country reaches its tipping point when the debt to GDP ratio approaches or exceeds 77%. In the third quarter of 2020, the U.S. debt to GDP ratio was 127%. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the federal debt is now at $28.5 trillion. The 2021 federal budget assumes federal receipts of $3.8 trillion from all sources. At an interest rate of just 2.2%, interest on the federal debt will be $627 billion. That's 16.5% of the entire federal budget. Now, if Congress passes only $3 trillion of the proposed $6 trillion in new spending on top of the already anticipated $1 trillion of budget deficits, the federal debt will be $33 trillion at the end of next year. Now, if the interest rate increases from 2.2% to just 3%, interest due on that debt balloons from $627 billion to $990 billion. The projected 2022 budget assumes total revenue of $4.1 trillion, and $990 billion is 24% of the $4.1 trillion. Projecting ahead 5 years, if the deficit only grows by the projected $1.2 trillion a year, the federal debt will then be $39 trillion. At an interest rate of 5%, interest due on that debt will be a whopping $1.95 trillion. With projected revenue of $5.3 trillion in 2026, interest on the national debt would be 38% of the entire federal budget. However, if interest reaches its 1988 level of 8% by 2026, interest due on that $39 trillion debt climbs to $3.12 trillion, or 59% of total projected revenue. Now, clearly, that is just not sustainable. In order for the ruling class to continue providing the free benefits that people have come to expect, it will have to borrow even more each year. Eventually, though, those who are loaning the federal government money will realize they're running a higher and higher risk of not being repaid. And at some point, no one will be willing to loan the government any more money, and spending will have to be reduced drastically. Now, just who will bear the brunt of those cuts? Will it be seniors? Will it be those on government aid? Will it be the military or government workers? Now, almost all of us match our spending to our resources. When we have more, we spend more. The free benefits we've been receiving increase our resources, and people have come to rely on these benefits to feed and clothe their families and to pay their other bills. If these benefits suddenly disappear and people can't pay their bills, then businesses will collapse. There will be widespread panic. And this is the type of panic that will spur the government to print even more and more money until it reaches a point where no one will accept it. Unfortunately, all we have to do is look at recent events in Venezuela. Now, no, the U.S. is not Venezuela yet, but this is a current example of what excessive borrowing to fund increased spending can do. In conclusion, it would be nice to say that passing the FAIRtax will magically prevent the inevitable economic collapse that comes with funding too much spending with too much borrowed money. However, it won't. The FAIRtax is a far more efficient way to generate revenue for the government, but it will still be up to the President and the Congress to abide by sound economic policy. However, the FAIRtax will show every person in America multiple times a day that there is a cost to the government benefits they're receiving. It'll reduce the amount of annual increase in the federal debt by at least $1 trillion because it drastically reduces evasion. The FAIRtax brings back high-paying jobs to America that are now being forced overseas by the income payroll tax system. It will eliminate tax returns and the IRS, will prevent Medicare from running out of money by 2026. The FAIRtax will make Social Security solvent, and it will also rapidly increase the growth in the U.S. economy for the prosperity of all Americans. So, what can each of us do to make this happen? We can write letters and make calls to our elected representatives demanding that if the government really wants to eliminate the burden of filing income tax returns, they should enact the FAIRtax and do away with tax returns altogether. The great 18th century Irish statesman Edmund Burke made a statement that applies in many ways. Nobody made a greater mistake than he who did nothing because he could only do a little. Take back control. Help pass the FAIRtax. The IRS will be gone and we'll pay our taxes when we make purchases. We, not the ruling class and their minions in D.C., will decide how much federal tax we pay. If you have friends who don't know about the FAIRtax, send them to FAIRtax.org. Have them watch the whiteboards under how it works, and if they agree, ask them to please join us. Then, contact your members of Congress and the President and demand that Congress pass the FAIRtax, the only truly fair tax.
This has been the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, President of Americans for Fair Taxation. Check back every week for news and information about the fair tax and learn why the fair tax should replace our antiquated federal income tax system. If you'd like to receive a copy of the Chairman's Report in your inbox every week, sign up at FAIRtax.org.